Hi, welcome to this quick video on chapter 11 and 12, inner and outer joins. We won't be doing anything from chapter 13, but you can kind of read from it to get an idea of those types of joins. So in order to explain joins, I've got the AP database diagram up in front of me so that you can kind of see, you've been working in these tables. You've got the terms table, the invoices table, the invoice line items, the GL accounts, the vendors. So right now, these are all sitting in separate tables. All this data is sitting in separate tables. But let's say you actually wanted to print an invoice. At the top of the invoice was the invoice header information, who the vendor is, its invoice number, the date, and then kind of halfway down is the individual lines of that invoice, which would come from invoice line items. So basically, if I wanted to do like an invoice, I would need information from all of these tables. So relational databases show how databases are tied together. So for example, I can tie my vendors to my invoices because they have a common field of vendor ID. So over here it's a key field. In other words, it's only used once, but I can have that vendor may have more than one invoice. So that's a one-to-many relationship. Same with terms. The terms ID here, it's a little confusing on this one because, oh no, I'm sorry, this one is right. It's probably when you get in my guitar shop. If they name the fields the same, we're doing good. Terms ID and terms ID, it's easy to see how they match up. But sometimes they don't always name the fields the same way, even though they're talking about the same data. So down here, invoice line items, you can see in my invoice line item has a key of invoice ID and invoice sequence. What that means is each individual line cannot have a combination of an invoice ID / sequence can't be duplicated, which makes sense. I might have invoice 1, 2, 3 in lines 1, 2, 3. I don't want to have more than one line of the same invoice in the same sequence. So really what joins are is a way to bring data. So far, we've only been bringing data in from one table at a time. So with chapter 11, we start bringing data in from more than one table. So let me go to my query, and we'll start. Number 1 says to write a SQL statement that we're returning the following from the vendors and terms tables. So I see I've got the vendor ID, the vendor name, and the terms description. The vendor ID and the vendor name come from the vendors table, and the terms description comes from the terms table. So if I go back to my drawing, so I can see my vendors, my terms, and the way I tie those two tables together is I have a terms ID here. This is what I was thinking of that doesn't have the same name. I have a default terms ID here. So what I can do is I can tie these fields together using that field, that common field. So let me do this. Number 1. So if I'm going to start small, I'm going to start with the vendor ID, vendor name from vendors. So I see that I have 122 rows. And it kind of looks like I've got mine in an order by vendor ID. So I've got my vendors in order by vendor ID. All that I'm missing is the terms description. Like I said, that's going to come from my terms table right here, terms description. So what I want to do is I'm going to join, when I say from, I go ahead and say join terms on. Now I want to show you a trick here. I could say vendors.default terms ID is tied to terms.terms ID. Now I can bring, because I've joined that table, I can bring in the terms description. Go ahead and run this real quick. So you see, I have all the information, and this is exactly like the output. I just want to show you a trick real quick. The reason I have to do this, so I'm selecting from vendors, I'm joining it to the terms table, and the way that I'm joining it is that this is the field they have in common. In my vendors table, it's called default terms ID. In my terms table, it's called terms ID. That's the common field, so that's how I match them up. But you notice when I do that, I have to preface it with the table name, table dot, vendors dot, table dot. So that can get a little hairy, especially once we start getting into tables with long names. So this is a really good place. We've talked about aliases before. This is a really good place for an alias. And lots of times people just give an alias for a table like one letter. See, so I can go, instead of vendors, I can say V. Instead of terms, I can say T. Let me change this as. You can leave off the as word. So that's basically from vendors as V, join terms as T. Or I could leave off the as. So that's now given vendors an alias of V, the terms table an alias of T. So that's just a little shorter connotation than what I had before. I get the same information. Okay, moving on to number 2. It says I'm bringing the information from the invoices and the invoice line items. So I can see the invoice ID, invoice number comes from the invoices table, and the invoice sequence, the invoice line item description, and then invoice line item amount comes from the invoice line items table. So let's start with the first one. Select invoice ID, invoice number from invoices. It looks like it's in order by invoice ID. So I just got a couple of my fields first. So I've got 114 rows, okay? So now I want to be able to, if I come here, I'm going to join my invoices table to my invoice line items table. And the field they have in common is the invoice ID. Both of them have invoice ID. So I'm going to say from invoices, I'm going to call that I, join invoice line items. I'll call it ILI on the invoice ID from my invoices is tied to the invoice ID from my line items table. Now I want to show you something. When I run this now, I have a problem. And it says ambiguous column name invoice ID. What that means is because now that I brought in a second table, both of these tables actually have a field called invoice ID. It wasn't a problem up here because they were different, they were called something different. But now that I brought in both tables, invoices has an invoice ID and so does invoice line items. So whenever you see the word, whenever it says ambiguous column, it says, I don't know which table you want me to pull invoice ID from because it exists in both. So what I can do is I can just stick I before that, and that solves that problem. So that gets rid of it. So now I need to add on the invoice sequence number. Invoice line item description. And invoice line item amount, I believe. I'm not positive. Okay, and now what was funny was I only had 112 rows, was it, when I ran just from the invoices table. But I have 118 rows now, and that's because you'll notice, like down here, that invoice, this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, I have some duplication. It's because invoice ID 12 actually had 4 lines to it. All these other ones just had 1. So that's why there's some duplication. That's why I'm getting more rows. Now, one thing to note here is when I join tables together, when I just use the word join, that's the default type of join is an inner join. So what that means is it's only going to bring in information where there's a match in both tables. In other words, it only brought in invoices that have invoice lines. Let me see if there's any that are skipped here. Probably not. But it only brings in invoices that have invoice line items. It's not such a big deal here, but you'll see it in the next one. So that's called an inner join, and it only brings in where there's a match. If there happened to be an invoice without any invoice line items, which in this case doesn't make sense, it wouldn't bring them in. So number 3 says write the SQL statement will return the following from the vendors and the invoice tables. Note, it will only return vendors who have invoices. It should return 114 rows. So let me do number 3. Let me show you something first. If I select all my vendors, I see that I have 122 vendors. But I just told you that you're only going to get 114 rows. And that's because out of my 122 vendors, not all of them have invoices. So like I told you, when I do an inner join, it only brings back data where there's a match from both sides. Here's kind of a visual to look at it. And I might post this in Blackboard. An inner join only shows me the blue, the part where A and B match. A left join, which I'm going to show you here in a minute, brings everything from the left side, everything from A. This one I'll show you also. Maybe I do a left join and I'm looking for ones that are in A but not in B, and I'll show you how to do that one. Don't worry about right joins or full joins. We're not doing so. Basically, just these first 3. So on number 3, so I just told you there's 122 vendors. So I'm gonna pull in the fields I want from the vendor is vendor name. I'm gonna call this V join invoices I on the vendor ID from vendors matches the vendor ID from invoices. And it looks like it's, I don't see any certain sort order. We'll see how this runs. So I run it, and so I brought in just my vendor ID. So now that I've got my invoices, I can go ahead and tack in my invoice number, invoice total, okay. So you can see that looks like number 3. And that's why there's only 114 rows. In other words, and it's not even saying that there's 114 vendors that have invoices. Of the vendors who have them, there's only 114 rows. Like Blue Cross has 3 different invoices here. IBM has 2. Okay, so moving on to number 4, write the SQL statement that will return the following from the vendors table and invoices table. This will return all vendors whether or not they have invoices. So if I go back to my visual, so I want all of them whether or not they have invoices. So that's where I want to do a left join. So basically, I want everything from table A. So let me show you how to do number 4. Select vendor name from vendors. Let me run this real quick. Really, it's just going to be, I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm going to copy and paste this because it's almost exactly like number 3. I'm going to change one word. I'm going to say left. In other words, if I go back to my table A is the left table, that's my first table I list. So that's vendors, that's invoices. So this is going to bring all of my vendors, whether or not, it'll show me the ones that do have invoices and the ones that don't. So when I run this, when I change it to the left, space in there. Now I get to see which vendors I actually have that don't. If it doesn't have matching data, it will say null. So all these ones that say null are ones that exist in the vendors table but don't exist in the invoices table. So number 5 says, write the SQL statement will return the following information vendors who do not have invoices. So if I go back to this visual, that's this third one. In other words, I want the vendors here that do not have invoices. This little crossover is the vendors, where they have vendors who do have invoices. This colored part of A would be not. So you can notice there's a null here. So if I look at this last one, basically what I want to do is I want to pull the same query, but I'm only wanting the ones where this is null. I'm not wanting the ones who have invoices. So let me come up here. Select vendor name. Actually, I'm going to do this. This is actually a copy of this one as well with a little tweaking. So this one gave me all of them, right? So really, if I want to narrow them down, I just say where invoice number is null. So if I run that, now I get all the ones that are null, all the ones that don't have invoices. So that's all I did is I took the other one and narrowed it down a little bit. Except for I just noticed my instructions say that there was a vendor number, vendor ID, vendor name, and vendor city. And I should get a nasty error about that ambiguous thing because I didn't put the V before it. Because even though I'm not bringing any fields in from the invoices table, remember both of them, invoices and vendors, have a vendor ID. So I have to tell it which vendor ID do I want to pull. Okay, number 6. Difference between number 6 is I am pulling information from 3 tables: vendors, invoices, and invoice line items. Getting the vendor ID, vendor name from vendors, the invoice number, invoice total from invoices, and the invoice line item amount and invoice line item description from the invoice line items. So let's start with that one. So we already had one that had I'm basically building on another one. So let's see. Number 3 had part of it. So let's copy and paste that. Number 3. Copy. Paste. Okay, so that gives me my first 3 fields, right? Gives me my vendor name. Nope, I'm wrong. Hold on. I pulled in the wrong stuff on number 3, but no, I copied the wrong one. Let's try this again. Oh no, I just ran the wrong one. Okay, there we go. So I got the vendor name, invoice number. I need to add in the vendor ID here. So v.vendor ID. So that gives me the first 4 fields: vendor ID, vendor name, invoice number, invoice total. Let's see these if I pull them out. Okay, now I need the information from the invoice line. So I've joined on the invoices, okay? I can join a third table. It's kind of like a chain link effect. I'm pulling from the vendors, which is joined to invoices, and then I'm pulling from invoice line items, which is joined, it's kind of like I'm joining this one to this one to this one. It's kind of like a chain effect. So what I can do here is I can just stick another join on here. Join invoice line items, we'll call ILI, on invoice ID equals invoice line items invoice ID. At that point, I can pull in the invoice line item amount, invoice line item description. So I'm joining the vendors, I'm joining these 2 tables together based on the field they have in common, which is vendor ID. And then I'm joining these 2 tables. From there, I'm joining that information to the invoice line items based on they have the common ID of invoice ID. So if I run this, I get everything that's shown. And it looks like I have to put an order by vendor ID. Let's try this. Okay, so that looks like the printout. Okay, so number 7 kind of takes that one step farther. Now I'm going to take that information, because you notice the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns are the same as one before, and now I'm adding on account description. So I go back to my thing here. I've got vendors, which is tied to invoices, which is tied to line items, which is tied to accounts. And the way these 2 are tied is I have account number here and account number here. So if I come back here, I'm just going to copy number 6 because that's my starting point. And now I'm just going to, before the order by, I'm going to stick another join in there. Join, what's my field? It's called GL accounts. GL accounts. I'll just call that GL on invoice line items, account. Let me look real quick. Account number is tied to the GL account number. So now I can bring in that last field of account description. And I get all the information that I see on that screenshot. So make sure you read and you play with and you try to understand joins, because they're a really, really important part of relational databases. If it was me on both, and I think I posted these in Blackboard, I'll double check, but you should have a diagram sitting in front of you so you can see how they're physically tied together. There's a diagram for the AP database, and when you guys go to do your homework for the My Guitar Shop, there's a diagram for it as well. Let's see if I saved it in mine. Yeah, so My Guitar Shop has the same thing. You can see how the tables are tied together here by the lines. So if you have any questions, be sure to ask, and I hope this helps. Thanks.